Hello and welcome back to another episode of Your Own Account by Qdos. I'm Nicole Slowey.
I'm Seb Maley.
And I'm Sam Cox.
And this is our final episode of season 1.
It's been a blast.
It's been emotional.
It has. So we thought that it was a good opportunity to actually use the last one as a bit of a roundup of kind of the common industry myths and trying to sort of debunk them in terms of a lot of the...
Or confirm.
Or confirm.
No spoilers.
That's true, yep. So yeah, I think that we all know all the kind of questions we get asked quite regularly and the kind of odd things that exist out there in the ether that people just think apply in the contracting space or the wider self-employed space. So yeah, let's get right into it. So with IR35, there's obviously lots. 2-year rule.
Yeah. That one has been doing the rounds for as long as I have
Exactly. I grew up with the 2-year rule.
Yeah, exactly. Such a common misconception. And the misconception is that there's a limit on how long somebody can be a contractor for an organisation.
Yep.
It's not true.
No. I think there probably is a seed of wisdom to the rule in that obviously the longer an engagement goes on, then the harder it is to establish that someone is legitimately self-employed or, integrating with the business over a very long period of time is a legitimate concern. Yeah. But there's no formal time limit on that. There's no piece of legislation that says 2 years is the maximum that someone can be self-employed with a single client. Yeah. It's amazing how pervasive that one's been.
It really is. Yeah. And it's one that has moved from contractors, which obviously historically have borne the brunt of IR35, but even in the public and private sector now, post-reform, they are asking those questions as well. So it's something that is just a perennial myth. It does stem from...
an expenses point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this kind of concept that you can only claim expenses to a place of work for a specific period of time, or a place that's not of work that then is considered your place of work after that 2-year period. So there is an element of understanding why it's there, but your point is right in that the point around tenure and thinking about how long contractors should or shouldn't be engaged by a client organisation definitely adds fuel to the fire. But categorically, that one is in fact a myth.
Yeah, I think we put a graphic up on screen. But yeah, I do quite like it as a point of discussion, though. So it's one of those myths that isn't technically correct, but does have at least some grounding to make it an interesting discussion point with clients. So yeah.
Another one, sort of along similar lines, is that you sometimes hear people say that if you don't have more than one client. You must be caught. If you've got one sole client, then you must be inside I-35. Yeah. Again, that's not true.
No.
But that is an interesting one because I think certainly outside of the UK, that is a rule that is used, isn't it?
Literally dividing line in a lot of countries from what we've seen. Obviously, haven't surveyed the entire globe, but yeah, and to be fair, it's actually quite a sensible way of defining a contract if you are solely engaged by one hirer. But yeah, there's nothing in the IR35 legislation that points to that. But it is sort of similar to that 2-year point in that actually, whilst it's not part of legislation and you can quite comfortably work compliantly with one client on a self-employed basis, having multiple clients is undeniably a benefit in establishing self-employment.
Yeah. No, it definitely is. And obviously, recent Chapter 8 IR35 cases, the consideration of having more than one client and being in business on your own account has been a bit of a key feature.
Yeah, it's been a massive feature, yeah.
So that one's a... sort of a myth, but sort of a truth. Sort of a myth and sort of a truth.
Myth. Let's go with that.
Yeah. Okay. Next.
Statements of work.
Well, we did a glorious episode all about this.
We did.
So I think we could probably surmise, can't we?
Yeah, and weirdly, and this is very geeky, that's one of this statement of work contracted out service thing is one of the things I actually quite like talking about the most from an IR35 perspective.
Very geeky.
Yeah.
Get a tattoo.
So the concept of a statement of work and that being this golden ticket from an IR35 perspective that if you're a contractor engaged under a statement of work, you're automatically considered outside of IR35.
which obviously doesn't apply, as we covered in detail. I think it's that misappropriation of the statement of work model that has caused a lot of ambiguity there, though. Which so if there's a lot of contractors that may be of the opinion that if their contract is set out as a statement of work, that means it's an IR35 workaround, which simply isn't the case. But this is where it does get a little bit more complex, where there's a legitimate statement of work model via a consultancy model. It doesn't remove IR35 as a consideration or really impact on the status of the workers, but it does impact who's got responsibility, and that's the thing to focus on, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think as well, from a out-and-out IR35 perspective, if you're thinking about an individual contractor being engaged via a legitimate statement of work framework where there are deliverables and there maybe are milestone-based payments, those things are actually helpful from an IR35 perspective. Like they can actually quite positively support an outside IR35 determination. Doesn't take away the need for a determination to be done, and doesn't guarantee that determination is going to be outside of IR35.
No, but it does set, as you suggest, a solid commercial footing for the nature of the services. So again, it seems as though all of these myths do seem to have some sort of rooting in a logic or something that could be helpful.
I think the thing about the statement of work point is that it has been something that has been bandied about through IR35 reform that has now in itself become something that has a bit of a contrived and not particularly great reputation, but in actual fact, like we said, it can be helpful. It is a mechanism and a means to engage a worker, but it doesn't guarantee a certain type of IR35 status.
Exactly.
So beyond statement of work, one thing we've touched on quite a lot on the podcast is HMRC's CESS tool. And that there's probably two misconceptions related to CESS. So the first one is that client organisations have to use CESS as a means to make determinations, and that one is categorically a myth. HMRC issue it as a means to support organisations. I think personally it can be useful and a bit of an educational tool that organisations can use to familiarise themselves with status and, more importantly, how HMRC think about status. But they don't have to use it.
No, and that was a very prevalent myth, particularly around the off-payroll reforms when they were kicking in. A huge amount of the consultancy work that we did with clients was actually debunking that very point. And I think at that time, CEST was actually a bit more flawed. I think the more recent updates have improved the outcomes, but not only is it not a requirement for people to be using them, it's also a difficult tool that won't actually get a fully comprehensive view of a worker's status. I think that at certain points the indeterminate outcomes with the CESS were, exactly. Not actually practical for them to use it as a platform.
And I think that's another point also, is that some a lot of clients come to us because they don't just need the results, they actually want a management process.
Absolutely.
CESS doesn't give you that. It does. You effectively just get a PDF printout that can be used as a status determination, but it doesn't give you the audit trail. It doesn't give you the ability to actually manage the process and oversee the process.
Are there any types of businesses that you think you would recommend actually CESS is probably just suitable for you? That is the best course of action. Is there any one that sort of falls into that category?
It's a good question. Thank you. And like I said, I agree. I think CESS does have its purpose. I think it's fine. And it was an unenviable task, I think, for HMRC to come up with an algorithmic tool to determine status. They gave it a shot.
And again, in HMRC's defence, I think they did caveat the tool along those lines as well. It was never the definitive view. It was a guide.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could potentially use CESS to get an idea of. I would never use CESS for individual determinations for limited company workers. But if you're looking at building up a profile for a particular role, then potentially using CESS as a bit of a guidance tool in that respect, I think could be useful. Maybe in non-sort of typical contractor sectors.
I think that probably is fair. If it's a one-off role for a business that really doesn't engage on this basis, they've got a high level of confidence that what they want is a genuinely external resource and have just got this obligation to do a status determination, then actually a quick and easy job of assessed is probably a reasonable way to approach. But yeah, that overall management tool side of things is a bit of a shortcoming, and really does come down to human interaction, and that algorithm-based determination that we're talking about. To be fair, is probably legitimate in the majority of cases, but actually where you need the most support are the cases where there's more nuance. And that's where a little bit of human interaction can come in, a bit more of a pragmatic approach to the detail, which simply can't be done via a tool like SEST.
And I think that's the problem is that you don't get, and if you do have an indeterminate result, obviously there's a prompt that you can speak to HMRC. But I think what was that story last week about people spent something million hours on hold. 8 million hours on hold. Which is great.
Makes you proud.
Coming on to my second SEST myth then was at the kind of early stages of reform, and I can never remember if it was in the public sector or in the private sector, but there were certain pieces of information or points of guidance that were published by HMRC where it, I would say, more than inferred that HMRC would stand by SEST determinations.
Yeah, which is a massive red herring.
Yes.
So yeah, this is one, and I think that's part of the reason that a lot of people defaulted to the tool is to say, well, look, if we use this, then they're not going to come after us. But obviously, that is that pledge is only ever going to be accurate if all of the information used to generate that result is categorically correct, and HMRC are going to test that.
They won't argue with the outcome of the SEST determination. They will argue with the information that's been put into the SEST determination.
And I think that's it, is that red herring sort of suggested or circumvented the point of clients having to take reasonable care when they're actually arriving at determinations as well.
I actually think that is probably the most problematic element of it all, because obviously there is that specific reference to reasonable care within the legislation. HMRC have produced a tool which actually most advisors would be saying using that in isolation would not be reasonable care, and there is an incongruity to that. I think HMRC probably should have addressed, I think some of the findings of the public sector early inquiries were just immediately apparent that actually SEST had been used in a lot of these cases, and HMRC applied the legislation anyway.
Absolutely,
One of, and this is probably more of a technical one, I would say, that if you're operating via an umbrella company, you are automatically or are considered inside IR35.
Yeah. I suppose those are disparate things, aren't they?
They are.
So if you do need to operate inside IR35, then an umbrella company would be a reasonable and practical solution for you to do so. But just because you're working through an umbrella company doesn't mean that you're automatically inside IR35. There are plenty of workers who are working through umbrella companies that actually had that decision been made around the off-payroll reforms to maintain a self-employed relationship, could be completely legitimately engaged on a continuing basis through a PSC. But I think it's probably inevitable, isn't it, that when umbrella companies are the most practical solution for placing workers inside IR35, then it almost becomes a defining characteristic of inside IR35 work.
I've just been running through it all in my head because it's confusing. Because the second that you use an umbrella company, I-35's gone.
Because you're an employee.
You're an employee, so you're not technically inside I-35, but it's one of those. It's the tag that is used for contracts, I guess. But I've just given myself a brain.
Because that's the thing, when you are an agency and you're advertising for roles, roles come with inside IR35 or outside IR35 with it.
It's not strictly accurate.
And it's not strictly accurate, because the roles that are inside IR35 are often via an umbrella company or by some sort of by a PAYE mechanism via the recruitment agency. And like you say, when you're operating in those ways, the IR35 status point isn't really applicable, because the way in which you're actually contractually engaged and how you are paid is akin to an employee-employer relationship. You are being taxed like an employee because that's the level of your engagement. So it's one of those nuanced things that cropped up as a result of, well, umbrella is the default solution for payrolling contractors who are not outside IR35 but aren't strictly technically inside IR35.
That was far better. We both struggled far too. It's been a long week. It's been a very long week. So that was. But did you have that written down?
I did not.
It's but true inside I-35 you will very rarely see.
Yes.
As in somebody still operating through a limited company, but
Yep.
having the tax deducted by the fee payer.
Yeah.
At source.
I'm still not sure we've been able to form a view on how best to manage that mechanism either, that inside operation. So
yeah, well, I think that's why agencies struggled with it, and
we
and
really
obviously
don't
defaulted
see it.
to umbrella companies.
Tens of thousands of workers we've done determinations
crazy,
for,
isn't it?
and that
I mean, it's
very rarely
understandable.
crops up.
It's understandable, but
completely.
it's slightly ridiculous when that is, there's so much in the legislation which says how you do this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
You know,
That deemed payment
and it just
calculation.
does not happen. Which,
Yeah.
is that something HMRC need to have a look at?
Yeah, and it's tricky as well because one of the reasons why you would potentially advocate for that option is for contractors to retain a level of flexibility to still have their own limited companies.
Which is
because
absolutely fair.
from contract to contract, you're not necessarily going to always be operating inside or outside, depending upon who the client organisation is, what the nature of the work is.
And this is what we're seeing now: is that in the run up to April 21, a lot of contractors were determined a lot of contractors ended up going through umbrella companies, closed their companies down. But now what we're seeing is people opening limited companies up again. We're seeing it in our own client base. There's lots of people coming back to us who have had to set new companies up just because they thought that closing the company down was the best option, and had obviously they had to go via an umbrella company.
Yeah. As an extension of the inside IR35 topic, one that we've all definitely had lots of conversations with individual workers, I would say, more so than maybe clients or recruitment agencies, but that a blanket determination and a policy ban or a policy position on no longer engaging contractors are the same thing.
Mm-hmm. And I think it does. So they're absolutely not the same thing. But I think there is a little bit of a view that obviously that blanket determination piece and in the legislation where that's specifically called out, I think is to prevent people making blanket outside determinations. Actually, what we see far more commonly is people taking a decision across the board that works are going to be engaged outside IR35, inside IR35 or via umbrella companies, is more correctly to put it. In doing that, they are obviously referring to a blanket decision, but that's not actually a blanket determination. That is, as you suggest, a policy decision that's been made. So I think that's a terminology point as much as anything else.
Yeah, it definitely is. Before we move away from IR35, and this is always one of my favourites, contractors not being allowed to go to company Christmas parties.
That's another age-old point.
Yeah, remember those days. Yeah. Do you want to cover that one?
You might know better than I do, but I don't actually know where that specific point came from, whether it was referenced in a case at some point, whether it was used as an example in a guide. I'm not sure. But, it all comes down to integration with the client organisation. So if you are part and parcel of that organisation and you're invited on all of the company jollies and get all of the benefits of being in a bigger business, that is problematic from an IR35 perspective.
Yeah.
But equally, if there's a company Christmas party and it's clearly designated that employees get X and we're also inviting external workforce, of course there are businesses that would invite their clients or their suppliers to their Christmas party. It's not an unusual thing for external people to be part of that party. I think it needs to be managed carefully. It needs to have an eye on it just to make sure that you're not lumping in contractors with employees. But fundamentally, it's only ever going to be a minor point.
Yeah, I think, well, firstly, do you remember when we had a Christmas party and a load of mechanics from the garage next door came?
Yeah, I do.
Similar.
They were good lads. You speak there in almost derogatory terms. I had a fantastic night with those guys.
But what was I going to say? So, I think our advice historically was that contractors can go, but you should probably pay for it.
Which would be a practical way of dealing with it. Also, sitting them in a separate, segregated area with all the other contractors. And
integration with the client organisation is definitely the one that comes up with the most interesting or odd.
It does. You get the weirdest questions, don't you? And it's fair. Anyway, I've had a few conversations recently where organisations, engagers of contractors, are looking to. They want to do something nice for the people that they engage. They're not treating them as employees, but they also want it to be an attractive and appealing place for contractors to work. So they're saying, "Oh, could we give some benefits?" And you're like, "Oh gosh, no, don't call it that."
Yeah, because I think a big thing for a lot of large corporates especially is thinking about well-being.
Yeah,
And that's one of the kind
exactly.
of key things in terms of extending.
And what do you do with contractors with that?
It's tricky.
You think most organisations will have like a wellbeing app or
Yeah,
something
things like that.
And what do you do there?
I think with my cynical insurance head on, a lot of those well-being elements are actually about that duty of care that businesses have to their employees, which is where the muddying of the waters come in. But just because there is a legitimate self-employed population of workers within your business, that doesn't actually remove the fact that there is a concern for those suppliers will be in a better position to deliver their services if they're well looked after. Now, obviously, that needs to stop short of becoming an employer-employee relationship, but actually offering things like tickets to the Christmas party or other fringe benefits. It's a grey area. It's difficult, but it should be workable. And I think there's quite a lot of virtue in businesses continuing to plough that furrow.
Yeah, and more commercially, in terms of larger corporate organisations, you'll have sustainability policies, and that extends to your full supply chain, so not your individual contractors, but the actual large suppliers that you engage in. It will consider things like that as well. So it's natural that type of question does actually come up quite often. But the Christmas party point in isolation.
So are we going to make an official judgment on this to say that our best practice advice is that contractors can come to the Christmas party, but they have to wear a specific contractor hat?
A special party.
Should we make some Qdos hats to give to the...
we could sell them.
Yeah, fantastic idea. Come to our website soon.
Moving away from IR35 then, and thinking about it perhaps more specifically on insurance, the concept that contractors don't necessarily make claims against their business insurance policies.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting one, and it's it is inherently low risk. So the nature of contracting arrangements in the majority of cases will be that the hiring organisation actually has their own professional expertise. There's a larger business operation at play there, and it's not uncommon in those types of contractual situations for the bigger party to be taking the majority of the liability there. So claims against contractors are certainly more rare than if they were small businesses operating with numerous clients in a more sort of traditional commercial capacity. But particularly on the public liability and professional indemnity side of things, you do see claims. Ultimately, the contractors are providing a professional service, and an error or omission in their work can lead to a third-party loss, and quite rightly, the contractor is the liable party in a lot of those cases. Now, again, typically those claims can be relatively low value from a commercial perspective, so tens of thousands of pounds as opposed to millions of pounds. But larger claims can certainly happen. And when you are a one-man band PSC, well, a £50,000 claim is going to be massively problematic. So those insurances are certainly valid. I think where contractors have a slightly more cynical view, which I do agree with, is actually on the employer's liability side of things. Claims for employer's liability is with PSC contractors is inherently very, very rare because they are typically the only employee of that business. They are the owner and operator of that business, and therefore that prevents claims being brought against their themselves. What you do find, though, is that a lot of businesses, both agencies and hiring organisations, will have standard terms that say that contractors need to carry employers' liability insurance. So there is a certain element of accommodation from contractors in making the decision. Okay, well, I can buy a relatively low-cost policy and meet this contract requirement, or I can be a bit of a thorn in the agency or the client side and fight this point. So a lot of them just roll over and buy the policy, which isn't ideal. And I think our advice to contractors inherently is, if you have got flexibility around that, if you are genuinely the only employee of your own business and you are the sole director of that business, then if you feel as though you can get flexibility from your client or your agency to remove that term, that's the best thing for you. But sometimes the path of least resistance makes sense.
What's the situation with the fact that it can be a legal requirement? What's the story
and
there?
In some cases that will apply to a PSC contractor, and it's a particularly galling one for lots of contractors because they may have a spouse who is the other shareholder. Now, technically speaking, the Employers' Liability Compulsory Insurance Act does set out that any business where the owner of the business, or sorry, the sole employee of a business is also a 50% shareholder, then the requirement to carry employers' liability doesn't apply. But obviously, if you do have another director who may be a husband or a wife or even a family member, then that can't necessarily be relied upon, and it's a bit of a paper exercise to say, okay, well, technically, legally, you are required to carry this policy. So yeah, where that type of structure is in play, then it is a legal requirement. But no, if a contractor is legitimately the 100% shareholder of their limited company and they are the only employee, they are exempt from the compulsory insurance element. But it does get into a more complex point of insurance law as much as anything else. And again, sometimes the path of least resistance is the easier one. It's a relatively low cost policy, but that question that you asked at the outset, Nick, was whether or not contractors get claims. And we have seen a few examples of contractors looking to make claims under the employer's liability section of their policy, and in some very rare occasions they do actually attach. Now, it's probably not the right forum to talk about when that would apply, but yeah, I've got a lot of sympathy with contractors who have a cynical view as to their requirement to carry employer's liability insurance. But the general commercial insurances definitely have a place.
Yeah, because ultimately, contractors are in business in their own account and they carry a financial risk.
Absolutely. And they will uniformly be signing a contract that makes it very clear what that risk is and very prescriptive as to what insurance protections they need. So there's not really an excuse not to be considering that.
Yeah. This is perhaps going off topic somewhat because it's not strictly a myth, but how do you see that kind of approach around insurance being applied differently when it's non-PSC? So you're thinking of people who are sole traders, freelancers, in the non kind of typical PSC space. There's not typically the contractual requirement to hold insurances.
Although it does still apply,
in
a lot of cases, particularly in the CIS space. So typically there would be a sole trader as opposed to a limited company. There are slightly different rules again around employers' liability, which we won't go into in detail here. But no, you do still see agency and hire terms that stipulate that workers need to carry their own insurance. Actually, interestingly, on the CIS side of things, I've noticed it is actually a little bit more of a leaning towards a compliance point. Obviously, trying to demonstrate self-employment is something that under a sole trader model is sometimes a little bit trickier to do than under a PSC model. There is a school of thought that says carrying those types of insurances would be a good way to demonstrate in business-like characteristics and help bolster the view that it's a self-employed arrangement. But yeah, it's not as ubiquitous as it is for PSCs. So it is the case that some will be asked and some won't. But inherently, the type of work that particularly manual labourers are doing is far more likely to attract claims. And they can be actually drawn into other people's claims as well. If you're working as part of a wider project team, you come in to do your bit. Actually, that could have a knock-on effect on other side of things as well. So no, the requirement to carry insurance is probably slightly less contractual for sole traders compared to PSCs, but actually the legitimate need for it is arguably more enhanced.
Definitely. Moving off of insurance then, and this is quite I always find this myth quite an unfair one. And we have talked about it in different forums previously, but this kind of idea that all contractors are tax dodgers as well, that
not controversial at all.
that their driving force behind going into contracting and taking those steps is purely driven from a tax benefit, financial, I can maximise my amount of take-home pay.
And that historically was always the government's view. That's why I think they coined this term tax-motivated incorporation. So it was where, and that's part of the reason that IR35 came in, really, is that the government's view was that people were incorporating limited companies purely to pay less tax.
Do we think that actually at the time, so going back to the late 90s, that actually was a fair view?
Potentially. I mean, again, it's a controversial topic, but if I think back then, and I suppose the main difference then was that there was a differential. There was a significant differential in terms of not just the employer's national insurance, which is now what the big difference is between employment and self-employment, but all the other dividend taxes and flat rate VAT scheme. It was significantly more beneficial to operate through a limited company than PAYE then. So potentially it was, but unfortunately that has remained. That myth has remained.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those that it's sort of forgivable that perception does remain to a certain extent, because the tax benefits are inherent. If you are engaged on a self-employed basis, there are low rates of taxation both for you and the hirer that would apply. To say that nobody was motivated by that in terms of their career selections and their job selections, it's probably a little bit naive to say that there weren't contractors that go, actually, I know I would prefer to be working in a role where it's more tax efficient. But I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that either. But obviously it's got to be underpinned by legitimate rationale. Now, obviously, what HMRC have done is put in place the IR35 rules and the recent off-payroll reforms to really set that out in black and white. But I actually prefer to think about it more from a sort of a holistic view. And these contractors, whilst there is a tax advantage, they also give up a huge amount as well.
Yeah.
The holiday pay, the sick leave, the notice periods, pensions,
Yeah.
all of these benefits that you get of employment, they are foregoing. And I think that's completely legitimate, particularly now when the difference is, there's still a tax incentive for self-employment, but it's not what it was.
No, exactly.
I actually think it's quite equitable for someone to be able to take that position. That's not a tax dodge. That's there's probably a balanced position
Risk
there.
and reward.
Yeah.
What doesn't help is the mainstream press reporting of anything to do with IR35 or anything to do with people. You see it a lot where there's some expose that the TV presenter's using a limited company and like his kid's a director or something, but they always wildly misrepresent the tax position and just say, he so and so's incorporated a limited company, he's just going to pay 20% corporation tax. They don't ever mention that all of the income that he or she pulls out of their company is going to be taxed, is going to have income tax attached to it. So that really frustrates me from people who should know better.
It's an overly simplistic view, isn't it? When you're trying to shoehorn that story into a 2-minute section in a news bulletin at 9 o'clock on BBC One, it's hard to actually give a balanced view. Isn't it?
And it's always as well the ones that do make kind of mainstream press. It's people who are earning substantial amounts of money, people who will have substantial tax bills, but one of the bits that they often forget to include is the tax that they will already have paid. So it talks about it in a total tax concept. I think the Gary Lineker one was the one where the figure that was being reported was the overarching figure as opposed to the figure that he'd actually ultimately, what he would already have paid in taxes. So I do think, and I think that, like we said, the movements in tax rates over the last kind of 10 years probably have changed quite significantly, especially with dividend tax. That actually the differences or the gains to be had between employment and self-employment via a PSC are much
they're much smaller.
Much smaller.
The employer's national insurance is the big chunk now. But as you say, there are still some benefits, and obviously there's benefits in being able to structure things in the way that you want and putting saving into a pension and all that sort of thing through a limited company.
And even when we do our annual survey every year, when we ask our contractor clients what their drivers are about why they went into self-employment in the first place and actually what it is that keeps them in them, and the monetary aspect is not really ever in the top 3.
No,
it's about being your own boss. It's about the flexibility. It's about being this kind of specialist in your field where you have the opportunity to work on fun, interesting, exciting projects that otherwise you wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to do that if you were actually an employee. So on that positive note, I think we've debunked quite a few common industry myths.
Mythbusters.
Trademark. But no, I think it might be an interesting one for the next series to add a few more of these myths and do this type of jargon busting, myth busting type episodes. I think hopefully people have got some value from it.
Yeah, the jargon busting one especially as well. The
Saw your eyes light up when I said that. Got to do series 3 now.
Geekiness is coming out. It's ridiculous. But anyway, so thank you for tuning in and watching the latest episode. Like we said, this is the last in the series, so watch this space for what's to come next. As always, to stay up to date with anything news and views wise from Qdos, please subscribe to our various social media channels.